March 15, 1944. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Tokyo Bay, Empire, Japan. 0847 hours. Commander Toshiro Nakamura stands on a reinforced concrete observation platform overlooking the main construction dock, his white gloves clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the skeletal frame of what should be a fleet carrier. The morning sun glints off Tokyo Bay, casting long shadows across the shipyard with a hull Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship design, rises slowly, agonizingly, from the slipway. The sound of riveting hammers echoes across the facility, but it is a sparse sound, irregular, lacking the thunderous symphony that once filled this arsenal when Japan built a combined fleet that struck Pearl Harbor. Nakamura has been a naval architect for 17 years, educated at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, trained in the finest traditions of Nippon Kaigan engineering. He has studied the Essex-Class carriers the Americans are building, has examined the intelligence photographs smuggled from neutral ports, has read the reports from agents in the United States. The numbers in those reports seemed impossible, the product of American propaganda or faulty intelligence gathering. 24 Essex-Class carriers planned, already 6 commissioned and operating in the Pacific, another launching every 45 to 60 days. Each carrier displacing 27,000 tons, carrying 90 aircraft, capable of 33 knots. The Americans are producing fleet carriers, the most complex warships ever designed, at a rate that Japan cannot match even for destroyer construction. Nakamura turns his gaze from Shinano to the empty slipways beyond, slipways that once housed the construction of Akagi and Kaga, Shokaku and Zuikaku, the great carriers that gave Japan supremacy in the Pacific in 1941 and 1942. Those slipways are silent now, their cranes idle, their work crews reassigned to repair damaged warships or to build the small escort carriers that represent Japan's only realistic option for replacing carrier losses. The carrier war, the revolutionary form of naval combat that Japan pioneered and perfected at Pearl Harbor, has become a contest Japan cannot win because it cannot replace its losses while the Americans not only replace theirs, but expand their fleet with purpose-built carriers rolling from shipyards at incomprehensible speed. Nakamura removes his cap, wipes his brow despite the cool March air, and experiences a moment of clarity, so profound it feels like physical pain. Japan cannot build Essex-Class carriers every month not because Japanese engineers lack skill or Japanese shipyards lack capability. Japan cannot match American production because the entire industrial infrastructure required to sustain such construction, the steel mills, the electrical generation capacity, the machine tool production, the trained workforce, the raw material supply chains, does not exist in the Japanese Empire and cannot be created while fighting a war across the Pacific. The Americans are not simply building ships faster. They are revealing the vast chasm between Japan's industrial capacity and America's, demonstrating through steel and welding torches that the war was decided not at Midway or Guadalcanal, but in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, in the shipyards of Newport News and Philadelphia, in the economic might that Japan challenged without understanding its true scale. As Nakamura replaces his cap and returns to his office to review yet another set of material shortage reports, he understands what the admirals in Tokyo refuse to acknowledge. Japan is not losing the carrier war because of tactical failures or strategic mistakes. Japan is losing because it entered an industrial production contest it could never win, and every Essex-Class carrier that slides down American slipways is another proof of that fundamental miscalculation. What do you think enabled America to construct fleet carriers at monthly intervals, while Japan struggled to complete even one? Was it merely industrial capacity, or something more fundamental about the nature of the two nations and their approaches to modern warfare? Consider the infrastructure required to build a 27,000-ton warship, the supply chains needed to deliver millions of parts, and ask yourself, what does it take to turn industrial potential into overwhelming naval supremacy? The story of why Japan could not match America's Essex-Class carrier production begins not in 1944, but in the decades before Pearl Harbor, in the fundamentally different paths the two nations took toward industrialization, and the strategic choices each made about naval construction. When Japan attacked the United States Pacific Fleet on December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the finest carrier force in the world. 6 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers with highly trained air groups, veterans of the China War. capable of coordinated operations that no other navy could match. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent rampage to the Pacific demonstrated Japanese carrier superiority in the most decisive terms possible. But that superiority rested on a narrow foundation: a small number of highly capable ships, irreplaceable pilots, and an industrial base strained to its limits, simply maintaining existing fleet strength. Japan entered World War II with essentially the same carrier force it would fight with throughout the conflict, because Japanese industry could not produce new fleet carriers at rates sufficient to expand the fleet while simultaneously replacing combat losses. The Americans, by contrast, entered the war with a smaller carrier force, but with shipbuilding capacity and industrial infrastructure that could not only replace losses, but dramatically expand the fleet with improved designs produced at increasing speed. The Essex-Class carrier program, authorized before Pearl Harbor but accelerated after it, would ultimately produce 24 fleet carriers, with 17 commissioned during the war years. These were not emergency conversions or compromise designs. They were purpose-built fleet carriers, each representing over 21 million man-hours of labor, incorporating the lessons of early war experience, standardized for rapid production while maintaining high capability. The contrast between American and Japanese carrier construction during the war reveals fundamental differences in industrial capacity, strategic planning, and national resources that determine the war's outcome as decisively as any battle. The Essex-Class carrier design reflected American naval architecture philosophy: standardized construction for mass production, modular systems that could be prefabricated and assembled, overbuilt structures that sacrifice efficiency for survivability and ease of manufacture. Each Essex-Class carrier required approximately 21,000 tons of steel, thousands of miles of electrical wiring, over 150,000 individual items from suppliers across the United States, engines producing 150,000 shaft horsepower, aviation fuel storage for 240,000 gallons, magazines for 1,800 tons of ammunition, and bombs. Building even one such ship required coordinating hundreds of subcontractors, managing supply chains that stretched across the continent, training thousands of workers in specialized skills, and maintaining quality control across millions of components. The United States accomplished this not once but 24 times, with construction periods decreasing as production experience accumulated. The USS Essex herself, first of her class, required 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. By 1943, construction time had decreased to 16 months. By 1944, some carriers were being completed in 14 months, and if one measures from the launch date rather than keel laying, carriers were entering service every 40 to 60 days at peak production. This was industrial warfare at a scale Japan could not comprehend, much less match. What do you think Japan's naval planners thought when they received intelligence reports about American carrier production rates? Did they believe the numbers, or did they dismiss them as impossible exaggerations meant to damage Japanese morale? And when the evidence became undeniable, when American carrier task forces appeared in the Pacific with new ships every month, how did that reality transform Japanese strategic thinking? Japan's carrier construction during the war years tells a story of industrial inadequacy and strategic desperation. At the time of Pearl Harbor, Japan possessed 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. These ships represented the culmination of Japanese carrier development, incorporating lessons from nearly 2 decades of carrier operations. 4 of these carriers were lost at Midway in June 1942, a catastrophic defeat from which Japan never recovered. Shokaku was sunk at Philippine Sea in June 1944, and Zuikaku at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. To replace these losses, Japan completed during the war Taiho, an armored carrier commissioned in March 1944 and sunk 3 months later; Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, commissioned in November 1944 and sunk 10 days later by submarine attack; Onryu, commissioned in August 1944, Amaji and Katsuragi, both commissioned in late 1944. 5 fleet carriers to replace 6 lost, and 3 of those 5 entered service, so late they accomplished nothing. Additionally, Japan completed several light carriers and escort carriers converted from merchant hulls, or built specifically as smaller carriers. But these vessels could not perform fleet carrier missions and represented an admission that Japan could not build enough real fleet carriers to matter. The mathematics were brutal and decisive. America produced 17 Essex-Class carriers during the war years, while Japan produced 5 fleet carriers total, including conversions. The production ratio of more than 3-to-1 in America's favor translated directly into combat power ratios that made Japanese defeat inevitable regardless of tactical skill or strategic brilliance. The reasons for this disparity were rooted in fundamental differences in industrial capacity. The United States in 1941 produced approximately 75 million tons of steel annually. Japan produced 6.8 million tons. American electrical generation capacity was 10 times Japan's. American machine tool production, the machines that make other machines, the foundation of industrial capacity, exceeded Japan's by a factor of 12. American shipyard capacity, measured in slipways capable of building large warships, was roughly 4 times Japan's. But these raw numbers understate the true disparity because they measure only the industrial infrastructure that existed at the start of the war. The critical difference was that American industry could expand during wartime while Japanese industry could not. American steel production increased during the war, reaching 89 million tons by 1944. Japanese steel production declined, falling to 4.8 million tons by 1944 as raw material shortages and bombing disrupted production. American shipyard capacity expanded dramatically as new yards opened and existing facilities added slipways and workforce. Japanese shipyard capacity could not expand because of machine tools, steel electrical systems, and skilled labor required for expansion were unavailable. Japan entered the war at maximum sustainable production and declined from there. America entered the war at perhaps 40% of potential capacity and ramped up to levels that astonished even American planners. Captain Masateko Kimiya, a veteran carrier air group commander who served aboard multiple Japanese carriers and survived the war, wrote extensively about the industrial disparity in his post-war writings. We knew the Americans had greater industrial capacity than Japan. This was not a secret, and our naval planners understood the figures. What we did not understand was what those figures meant in practice, how industrial capacity translated into warships appearing in battle. When we received reports of Essex-Class carriers joining the Pacific Fleet in 1943, we assumed these were existing ships brought out of reserve or conversions accomplished quickly by utilizing merchant ship components. We could not believe the Americans were building purpose-designed fleet carriers from the keel up in less than 18 months. Such construction times were impossible by Japanese standards. Our fleet carriers required 30 to 40 months to complete, and that was before the war created material shortages. Only gradually did we realize the Americans had built a shipbuilding system that operated on principles we did not understand, with resources we could not match, producing results that made our own construction efforts irrelevant. Each Essex that appeared represented not just a ship, but an entire industrial infrastructure we lacked. The construction of a single Essex-Class carrier required coordinating a supply chain of extraordinary complexity. The main propulsion turbines came from specialized manufacturers, the reduction gears from others. Boilers required specialized steel alloys and manufacturing expertise. The flight deck demanded structural steel in quantities that required dedicated mill runs. Electrical systems required thousands of miles of copper wiring at a time, when copper was a strategic material in short supply globally. Fire control systems, radar sets, radio equipment, damage control systems, aviation fuel pumps, bomb elevators, arresting gear, each represented a specialized manufacturing capability. The United States possessed all of these capabilities in abundance and could expand them as needed. Japan possessed some of these capabilities in limited quantities and could not expand them because the machine tools and skilled workers needed for expansion were themselves in short supply and could not be quickly produced or trained. A concrete example illustrates the difference. American shipyards installing electrical systems on Essex-Class carriers could draw on copper wire produced by a domestic copper industry that mined over 800,000 tons of copper annually. Japan's copper production was approximately 80,000 tons annually, 1/10 American production, and much of that was needed for ammunition production. When Japanese shipyards needed copper for carrier construction, they competed with ammunition factories, electrical generation facilities, and communication systems for limited supplies. American shipyards never faced such choices because American copper production exceeded all military demands combined. What do you think it does to a nation's war-making capacity when even basic industrial materials must be rationed and priorities constantly reevaluated? When building a carrier means reducing ammunition production or accepting power shortages, how can such an economy compete with one where resources are so abundant that waste is economically tolerable? The workforce differences were equally significant. Building an Essex-Class carrier required approximately 21 million man-hours of labor, involving thousands of workers with specialized skills: welders, electricians, pipefitters, machinists, riggers, engineers. American shipyards expanded their workforce during the war from approximately 200,000 workers in 1939 to over 1.3 million by 1943. These workers were trained through systematic programs, many of them in factories and schools established specifically to produce skilled labor for war production. Women entered the shipyards in large numbers, eventually comprising significant percentages of the workforce in some yards. The expansion of the shipbuilding workforce was possible because American society had the educational infrastructure to train workers, the transportation systems to move them to shipyards, the housing to accommodate them, and the agricultural productivity to feed them while they worked in factories rather than farms. Japan lacked most of these prerequisites for workforce expansion. Japanese shipyard workers in 1941 represented a significant portion of Japan's available skilled industrial labor. Expanding the shipbuilding workforce meant withdrawing workers from other essential industries or from agriculture, creating shortages elsewhere. Training new workers required time and resources Japan did not have while fighting a war. The introduction of women into heavy industrial work occurred in Japan, as in America, but on a smaller scale and with less systematic training. By 1944, Japanese shipyards were using conscripted labor, including Korean forced laborers and student conscripts, workers with minimal training attempting to perform complex tasks. Quality suffered, construction times increased, and accidents became more frequent. American shipyards in 1944 were employing experienced workers, many with 3 or more years of wartime experience, using refined reduction techniques and specialized tools that increased productivity. The disparity in workforce capability paralleled the disparity in material resources, and both contributed to the vast difference in construction capacity. The sound of riveting hammers became, in the wartime economies of both nations, a symbol of industrial power and national mobilization. In American shipyards, the sound was thunderous and continuous. Hundreds of riveters working simultaneously on multiple ships, 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week. The sound of industrial might translated into steel warships. In Japanese shipyard by 1944, the sound was sporadic and intermittent as material shortages, labor shortages, and competing priorities meant that work proceeded slowly on the few carriers under construction. For American shipyard workers, the sound of the riveting hammers represented jobs, paychecks, participation in the war effort, and pride in building the ships that would defeat Japan. For Japanese workers, the same sound became reminders of impossible quotas, material shortages, and the growing realization that Japan's industrial capacity could not sustain the war Japan's military had initiated. The riveting hammer, that basic tool of industrial shipbuilding, became the symbol of the production contest that decided the Pacific War as surely as aircraft carriers and battleships. The strategic implications of the production disparity became evident in the carrier battles of 1944. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the United States deployed 15 carriers, 7 Essex-Class fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, against 9 Japanese carriers of all types. The American carriers launched approximately 900 aircraft. The Japanese carriers launched approximately 430 aircraft, many flown by replacement pilots with minimal training, because veteran pilots lost earlier in the war could not be adequately replaced. The Americans lost 130 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents. The Japanese lost over 600 aircraft and 3 carriers, including the fleet carrier Taiho and the light carrier Shokaku and Hayo. This catastrophic defeat, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, resulted not from Japanese tactical errors, but from overwhelming American material superiority. More carriers, more aircraft, better trained pilots, superior radar and communications, and the knowledge that American losses would be replaced while Japanese losses were irreplaceable. After the Philippine Sea, the Japanese carrier force ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, not because all the carriers were sunk, but because the air groups could not be reconstituted with competent pilots, and the carriers remaining lacked sufficient aircraft to accomplish meaningful missions. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese carriers were used as decoys, bait to draw American carriers away from the invasion beaches, because Japan no longer had the pilots or aircraft to use its carriers for actual combat. This was the ultimate admission of defeat in the carrier war. Japanese carriers reduced to floating targets, sacrificed to enable surface warships to attack transports. The weapon system Japan had pioneered and perfected, the form of naval warfare Japan had taught the world at Pearl Harbor, had become useless to Japan because it could not produce enough carriers or train enough pilots to remain competitive. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who led the Pearl Harbor attack and served throughout the war as an aviation staff officer, reflected in his post-war writings on production disparity. American industrial power was a hidden weapon that defeated us. We saw the Essex carriers appear in combat, one after another, seemingly without end. Each time we received intelligence of a new Essex commissioning, our staff officers would update the estimates of American carrier strength, and the projections became more and more hopeless. By mid-1944, we knew the Americans had more fleet carriers in the Pacific than we had possessed in our entire Navy at the start of the war, and more were arriving monthly. How does one plan strategy against an enemy that can replace in weeks what it took us years to build, that can absorb losses we would find crippling, and continue operations without pause? The answer is that one cannot. We were fighting an industrial power that we could not match, and every Essex-Class carrier that appeared was proof that the war's outcome had been determined by factors beyond military control, factors of steel production, shipyard capacity, and national resources that made Japanese defeat inevitable once America committed its full industrial strength to the conflict. The submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping compounded Japan's industrial problems by strangling the supply of raw materials essential for both carrier construction and operation. Japan, lacking domestic sources of oil, iron ore, rubber, and many other essential materials, depended on imports from the southern resource area, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and other conquered territories. American submarines, operating from bases in Australia and Pearl Harbor, systematically destroyed Japan's merchant fleet, sinking over 8 million tons of shipping during the war. By 1944, import of oil and other strategic materials had fallen to fractions of 1941 levels. Steel mills operated at reduced capacity for lack of iron, ore, and coal. Shipyards waited weeks or months for specialized components because the factories producing them lacked raw materials or electrical power. The construction of Shinano, the converted battleship that became Japan's largest carrier, took nearly 3 years, partly because material shortages repeatedly halted work. Even when the ship was finally completed in November 1944, she lacked many fire control systems and defensive weapons because the factories that should have produced them had been bombed or lacked materials. Shinano was sunk by submarine 10 days after commissioning, never having operated aircraft, a symbol of Japan's complete failure to translate ship construction into combat capability. The United States faced no equivalent material shortages. American steel mills operated at full capacity throughout the war. American shipyards never waited for materials. American carriers were completed with full weapons fits and electronic systems. The submarine campaign created a cascading failure in Japanese industry that made carrier construction progressively more difficult, while American industry operated without significant constraints. What do you think Japanese naval officers felt when they realized that their nation's entire industrial base was collapsing while America's expanded? When they understood that the decisive battle they sought could never change the strategic balance because American industry would replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them? How does military morale survive such realizations? The technological sophistication of the Essex-Class design revealed another dimension of American advantage. Each Essex-Class carrier incorporated radar systems for air search, surface search, and fire control, electronic systems that required specialized components Japan could produce only in limited quantities. The Combat Information Center, a dedicated space where radar data was integrated with visual sightings and radio reports to create a comprehensive tactical picture, represented an innovation in command and control that Japanese carriers never matched. American carriers feature redundant systems for damage control, with multiple fire mains, emergency generators, and compartmentalization that made them survivable even after severe damage. Japanese carriers, built with less steel and less internal volume, could not match the survivability. The difference showed in combat. The carrier Yorktown at Midway absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo hits and remained operational for hours, allowing her crew to be evacuated before she finally sank. The carrier Franklin, hit by bombs in March 1945 that killed over 700 men and caused catastrophic fires, survived and eventually returned to service. Japanese carriers typically sank rapidly when seriously damaged because they lacked the internal structure and damage control systems to survive major hits. The technological sophistication built into Essex-Class carriers reflected an approach to design that accepted higher construction costs and longer building times to produce more capable and survivable ships. Japan, constrained by limited resources, built carriers that were adequate when they entered service but lacked the margins of capability and survivability that American designs incorporated as standard. The crew requirements for carrier operations further illustrated the resource disparity. An Essex-Class carrier required a crew of approximately 2,600 officers and men. 24 Essex-Class carriers required over 62,000 trained naval personnel. The United States Navy expanded during the war from approximately 380,000 personnel in 1940 to over 3.4 million by 1945, an increase achieved through conscription, voluntary enlistment, and systematic training programs that graduated hundreds of thousands of sailors from specialized schools. Japan expanded its navy from approximately 200,000 personnel in 1940 to over 1.1 million by 1944, a significant increase, but one constrained by Japan's smaller population and by competing demands from the army and industrial workforce. More critically, the quality of training declined as the war progressed. American naval training maintained high standards throughout the war, with specialized schools producing radar operators, damage control specialists, aviation maintenance personnel, and other skilled ratings in quantity sufficient to crew the expanding fleet. Japanese naval training, constrained by shortages of fuel for exercises and by the need to rush graduates to replace losses, declined in quality. By 1944, Japanese carriers that did have aircraft often could not operate them effectively because flight deck crews and maintenance personnel lacked adequate training. The human dimension of carrier operations, the thousands of trained sailors needed to operate and maintain a fleet carrier, represented another constraint Japan could not overcome. Building the carrier was only the first step. Crewing it with trained personnel was equally essential, and here too American abundance contrasted with Japanese scarcity. By late 1944, the strategic situation in the Pacific had become hopeless for Japan. American carriers operated with impunity, launching airstrikes against targets throughout the Western Pacific, supporting amphibious landings, destroying what remained of Japanese naval power. Japanese carriers either had been sunk or sat in port, unable to operate for lack of aircraft, fuel, or trained pilots. The naval war had become one-sided to the point where American carriers faced greater risks from operational accidents than from Japanese opposition. The Essex-Class production program, which had seemed ambitious when authorized in 1940, had proven itself the war-winning investment American naval planners had hoped for. The carriers enabled American naval supremacy, supported the island-hopping campaign, and provided the mobile air bases from which American air power dominated the Pacific. And new Essex-Class carriers continued to arrive, one after another, through 1945, each one adding to a fleet that had already overwhelmed Japanese opposition. Some of these later carriers saw limited combat because the war ended before they could deploy to the Pacific, but their existence testified to the unstoppable momentum of American industrial production. Japan had challenged a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity, and the Essex-Class carriers were the visible manifestation of what that capacity meant when fully mobilized for war. Lieutenant Commander Tamichi Hara, who commanded destroyers throughout the war and survived, wrote about watching American carrier strikes in 1945. The American carriers would appear on the horizon, launch aircraft that darkened the sky, and systematically destroy everything within range. Then they would withdraw, refuel, rearm, and return days later to repeat the performance. We could do nothing but hide and hope to survive. The contrast of 1941, when our carriers had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effect, was absolute and demoralizing. We had pioneered carrier warfare, had demonstrated its potential, had taught the world how to use carriers in combat. But the Americans had learned our lessons, built carriers in numbers we could never match, and used them with proficiency and scale that made our own achievements seem trivial. The Essex carriers were not individually superior to our best fleet carriers. Our Essex-Class carriers were arguably better designs. But there were two Essex-Class carriers, and they both sank in 1944. There were 24 Essex-Class carriers, and they dominated the Pacific. This was a reality that determined the war. Not individual ship quality, but fleet numbers. Not tactical brilliance, but industrial capacity. Not courage, but the ability to produce and sustain overwhelming force. The economic cost of the Essex-Class program illustrated American industrial commitment. Each carrier cost approximately $70 million to construct in 1940s dollars, roughly $1.1 billion in modern currency. 24 carriers represented $1.7 billion in wartime expenditure, or nearly $26 billion in modern terms. This was a vast sum, but one America could afford because total U.S. war production expenditure exceeded $300 billion in 1940s dollars. Japan's entire national budget in 1941 was approximately $3 billion. The Essex-Class program alone cost more than half of Japan's entire annual national expenditure, and this was only one element of American naval expansion. The United States simultaneously built escort carriers, light carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and amphibious vessels in quantities that each individually exceeded Japanese construction of similar types. The financial dimension of production contest revealed fundamental truth. Japan had challenged an economy with a gross domestic product approximately 10 times larger than its own, an economy that could afford to devote vast resources to military production while simultaneously maintaining civilian production, agriculture, and infrastructure. Japan, operating at maximum sustainable mobilization by 1942, faced constant choices about how to allocate scarce resources. Every ton of steel used for carrier construction was steel that could not be used for merchant ships, ammunition, or infrastructure repair. Every skilled worker building carriers was a worker not available for other essential production. American planners faced few such constraints. The economy was so large that military production, though massive, represented a manageable fraction of total capacity. The symbolic power of the riveting hammer sound echoed through both nations' wartime experiences, but with vastly different emotional resonance. In American shipyards from Newport News to Brooklyn to Mare Island, the sound represented prosperity, employment, participation in a great national effort. Shipyard workers earned good wages, enjoyed job security, saw their work directly contributing to victory. The ships they built dominated newsreels and newspapers, sources of national pride and confidence. In Japanese shipyards, the same sound became associated with impossible quotas, inadequate materials, and shrinking hope. Workers labored under conditions of increasing hardship, often underfed, knowing their efforts could not match American production, seeing their work disrupted by air raids as American bombers reached Japan. The riveting hammer, the same tool, the same sound, became a symbol of national power for Americans and a reminder of national weakness for Japanese. When peace came in 1945 and the riveting hammers fell silent, the ships they had built remained. American harbors filled with Essex-Class carriers, many barely used, some never seen combat, evidence of productive capacity so vast it exceeded even wartime needs. Japanese harbors contained sunken wrecks, and a few surviving carriers too damaged or fuel-starved to operate, monuments to what industrial inadequacy meant in modern war. The lessons of the Essex-Class production program resonated through naval thinking for decades after the war. The realization that carrier construction could be standardized and mass-produced, that industrial capacity determined naval power more surely than individual ship quality or tactical doctrine, that modern naval warfare required industrial economies capable of sustaining production during multi-year conflicts. These became foundational principles of Cold War naval planning. The United States maintained carrier construction capability throughout the post-war period, ensuring that industrial knowledge and shipyard capacity would not atrophy. The Soviet Union, attempting to match American naval power, struggled with many of the same constraints that had limited Japan: inadequate industrial infrastructure, limited shipyard capacity, competing demands from other military services. The lesson that smaller economies could not match American carrier production influenced naval planning worldwide, contributing to the American naval dominance that persisted through the 20th century. The Essex-Class carriers, many of which served into the 1970s and several of which were modernized to operate jet aircraft, became the foundation of American naval supremacy, the physical manifestation of industrial power translated into military capability. What do we learn from this story about the relationship between industrial capacity and military power, about the limitations that constrain nations regardless of courage or tactical skill, about the importance of understanding one's own limitations before challenging opponents whose resources dwarf your own? The story of Japan's failed attempt to match Essex-Class production is ultimately a story about miscalculation, about a nation that understood the tactical dimensions of modern warfare, but failed to grasp the industrial foundations on which modern military power rests. Japanese naval officers studied carrier operations, developed effective tactics, trained superb pilots, and designed capable ships. But none of this mattered in the end because Japan could not build enough carriers to replace losses, could not train enough pilots to maintain air group quality, could not produce enough fuel to operate even the carriers that did exist. The Americans, with less refined tactics initially and less experienced pilots at the start, learned quickly, built ships in overwhelming numbers, trained crew without constraint, and operated with logistical abundance that made their advantages cumulative and decisive. The riveting hammers that built 24 Essex-Class carriers told a story of industrial power that determined the Pacific War's outcome as surely as any battle, a story of production lines and supply chains, of steel mills and shipyards, of the vast gulf between Japan's industrial capacity and America's, a gulf so wide that no amount of tactical brilliance or fighting spirit could bridge it. In the end, Commander Nakamura's realization on that March morning in 1944 proved prophetic. The war had been decided not by the carriers that fought at Pearl Harbor or Midway, but by the carriers that rolled out of American shipyards month after month, year after year, each one a physical manifestation of the industrial chasm between the two nations. Japan had entered a production contest it could not win, had challenged an opponent whose industrial capacity was so vast that Japan's efforts at matching it were futile from the start. The Essex-Class carriers were not simply ships. They were symbols of American industrial democracy, of an economy that could mobilize resources beyond anything authoritarian militarism could match, of the fundamental truth that modern warfare between industrial powers is decided as much in factories and shipyards as on battlefields. The sound of riveting hammers building those carriers was a sound of victory being forged, rivet by rivet, ship by ship, in a production race Japan never had a chance to win. And when the last rivet was driven and the last carrier launched, when peace came and the accounting was done, the lesson stood clear for all who would read it. In the industrial age, military power flows from economic strength, and nations that challenge opponents with vastly superior industrial capacity risk not merely defeat, but the comprehensive demonstration of their own inadequacy. This was the truth the Essex-Class carriers proved, the lesson Japan learned through fire and loss, the reality that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. The riveting hammers fell silent, but the ships they built remained, monuments to industrial power and reminders that in modern war, abundance is strength, production is power, and victory belongs to those who can build faster than the enemy can destroy.